Welcome to Heartline Stories. Today's story follows Clara, a brave young girl who must face impossible challenges to save her brother Daniel. A mysterious billionaire, a glowing crystal, and a hidden mountain full of secrets. Clara's world turns upside down when she's forced to make a shocking choice. But as she uncovers the truth, she realizes some powers are too dangerous to control. Will she succeed, or will the darkness win? Stay tuned to find out. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more thrilling tales. In a small, quiet town surrounded by thick forests, lived a girl named Clara. Clara was only 12 years old, but she had already faced more challenges than most kids her age. Her parents were gone, and she lived with her older brother Daniel, who worked hard to take care of them both. Daniel was everything to Clara, her protector, her best friend, and the only family she had left. One chilly autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara sat by the window, waiting for Daniel to come home from work. But hours passed, and he didn't return. Worry crept into her heart. Daniel was never late. Something was wrong. The next morning, a sleek black car pulled up to their tiny house. A tall man in a sharp suit stepped out, holding a shiny envelope. Clara's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter from a man named Mr. Grayson, a billionaire who lived in a towering mansion on the edge of town. The letter said that Daniel had borrowed money from Mr. Grayson and couldn't pay it back. Now Daniel was being held until the debt was settled. Clara's heart raced. She had to save her brother, but she had no money, no way to help him. The letter ended with an offer. Clara could come to Mr. Grayson's mansion and work for him. If she agreed, Daniel would be set free. But if she refused, she would never see her brother again. With no other choice, Clara packed a small bag and walked to the mansion. The gates were tall and intimidating, and the house looked like something out of a fairy tale. Huge, dark, and mysterious. Inside, the walls were lined with paintings of people who seemed to stare at her as she passed. A butler led her to a grand room where Mr. Grayson sat in a large chair, his eyes cold and calculating. He explained the deal. Clara would live in the mansion and complete a series of tasks. If she succeeded, Daniel would be freed, and they would never have to worry about money again. But if she failed, the consequences would be dire. Clara nodded, her heart pounding. She had no idea what the task would be, but she knew she had to try. The first task began the next morning. Clara was led to a massive library filled with dusty old books. Mr. Grayson handed her a list of titles and told her to find them all before sunset. The books were hidden in every corner of the library, some on high shelves, others tucked away in secret compartments. Clara climbed ladders, crawled under tables, and searched every inch of the room. Her arms ached and her eyes grew tired, but she didn't give up. Just as the sun was setting, she placed the last book on the table in front of Mr. Grayson. He nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "Not bad," he said, "but the next task will be harder." Clara didn't know what was coming next, but she was determined to keep going. She thought of Daniel, locked away somewhere, counting on her. She couldn't let him down. As the days turned into weeks, Clara faced more challenges. She solved puzzles, navigated mazes, and even braved a dark, spooky forest on the mansion grounds. Each task tested her courage, her cleverness, and her heart. But through it all, she never lost hope. One evening, after completing another difficult task, Clara found a strange key hidden in her room. It was old and rusted, with a symbol she didn't recognize. She wondered if it was part of Mr. Grayson's plan or something else entirely. Could it be the key to freeing Daniel, or was it a trick to test her loyalty? Clara tucked the key into her pocket, her mind racing with possibilities. She knew the hardest challenges were still ahead, but she was ready to face them. Whatever it took, she would save her brother. Clara woke up the next morning with the key still clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't know what it unlocked, but she felt it was important. The mansion was eerily quiet, and the usual sound of footsteps in the hallways was absent. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Mr. Grayson's butler appeared at her door, his face as expressionless as ever. "Mr. Grayson has requested your presence in the garden," he said, his voice flat. Clara nodded, slipping the key into her pocket before following him. The garden was unlike anything Clara had ever seen. It was vast, with towering hedges that formed a maze, colorful flowers that seemed to glow in the sunlight, and a small pond in the center. Mr. Grayson stood by the pond, his hands behind his back. He turned to Clara as she approached, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Your next task," he began, "is to find the golden locket hidden somewhere in this maze. You have until sunset. If you fail, your brother will remain where he is." Clara's heart sank. The maze looked enormous, and the thought of searching every corner for a tiny locket felt impossible. But she had no choice. She stepped into the maze, the hedges towering over her like giants. The air was cool and the sound of rustling leaves filled her ears. As she walked deeper into the maze, Clara noticed strange symbols carved into the hedges. They looked familiar, and after a moment, she realized they matched the symbol on the key she had found. Her heart raced. Could the key be connected to the maze? She decided to follow the symbols, hoping they would lead her somewhere important. The path twisted and turned, and Clara began to feel like she was going in circles. But she kept her eyes on the symbols, trusting her instincts. Finally, she reached a dead end. In front of her was a small hidden door covered in vines. The symbol on the door matched the one on the key. Clara's hands trembled as she pulled the key from her pocket and inserted it into the lock. It turned with a soft click, and the door creaked open. Inside was a tiny room, lit by a single beam of sunlight streaming through a crack in the ceiling. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it sat the golden locket. She grabbed the locket and hurried back through the maze, her heart pounding. When she reached Mr. Grayson, she held it out to him, her breath coming in short gasps. He took it, examining it closely before nodding. "Well done," he said, his voice cold. "But don't think this is over. The final task will be the hardest of all." Clara's stomach churned. She didn't know what the final task would be, but she knew it would test her in ways she couldn't imagine. She thought of Daniel, wondering if he was safe, if he knew how hard she was trying to save him. That night, as she lay in bed, Clara couldn't sleep. Her mind was filled with questions. What was the final task? What would happen if she failed? And what was the true purpose of the key and the locket? She felt like she was missing something important, like there was a bigger picture she couldn't see. The next morning, Clara was summoned to the mansion's grand hall. Mr. Grayson stood at the far end, his expression unreadable. In his hand was a small ornate box. He opened it, revealing a single glowing crystal. "Your final task," he said, "is to take this crystal to the top of the mountain behind the mansion. Place it in the altar there, and your brother will be freed. But be warned, the mountain is treacherous and time is running out." Clara took the crystal, her hands shaking. She looked out the window at the mountain, its peak hidden in the clouds. It looked impossibly far away, and the path was steep and rocky. But she had no choice. She had to try. As she stepped out of the mansion and began her journey, Clara felt a mix of fear and determination. She didn't know what awaited her on the mountain, but she knew she couldn't turn back. Her brother's life depended on her. The climb was harder than she expected. The path was narrow and slippery, and the wind howled around her, threatening to knock her off balance. But Clara kept going, clutching the crystal tightly in her hand. She thought of Daniel, of his smile, of the way he always encouraged her to be brave. She couldn't let him down. As she reached the halfway point, Clara noticed something strange. The crystal in her hand began to glow brighter, and the air around her seemed to hum with energy. She felt a pull, as if the mountain itself was guiding her. She followed the feeling, her steps growing faster. Finally, she reached the top. The altar was a simple stone structure, but it radiated power. Clara placed the crystal in the center, and a blinding light erupted from it. She shielded her eyes, her heart racing. When the light faded, Clara looked around, expecting to see Daniel. But instead, she saw something else. A hidden door in the side of the mountain, just like the one in the maze. The symbol on the door was the same as the one on the key. Clara's mind raced. What was behind the door? Was Daniel there? Or was this another test? She didn't know, but she knew she had to find out. She reached for the key in her pocket, her hand trembling. As she inserted the key into the lock, the ground beneath her began to shake. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, winding staircase leading down into the mountain. Clara took a deep breath and stepped inside, the crystal's light guiding her way. What she would find there, she didn't know. But one thing was certain, her journey was far from over. Clara descended the staircase, the glow from the crystal casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. The air grew colder with each step, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to keep moving. She had come too far to turn back now. The staircase seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning deeper into the mountain. Finally, it opened into a vast underground cavern. The walls sparkled with veins of gold and silver, and in the center of the cavern stood a massive, ancient tree. Its roots twisted into the ground like giant serpents, and its branches stretched high into the shadows above. Hanging from one of the branches was a cage, and inside that cage was Daniel. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Daniel!" she cried, rushing toward the tree. But as she got closer, she noticed something strange. The tree seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light, and the air around it felt heavy, almost suffocating. Before she could reach the cage, a voice echoed through the cavern. "Stop!" Clara froze. The voice was deep and resonant, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. She turned around, searching for the source, but saw no one. Then the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and the roots of the tree started to move, coiling and uncoiling like living things. From the shadows stepped a figure. It was Mr. Grayson, but he looked different. His eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the tree, and his skin seemed to shimmer like the walls of the cavern. He smiled, but it was a cold, unsettling smile. "You've done well, Clara," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "But this is where your journey ends." Clara's mind raced. "What do you mean? I found the crystal. I brought it to the altar. I did everything you asked. Let my brother go." Mr. Grayson shook his head slowly. The crystal was never the end goal. It was merely a key to unlocking the true power of this mountain. And now that you've brought it here, that power is mine to control. Clara's heart sank. She had been tricked. All this time she thought she was saving Daniel, but she had only been playing into Mr. Grayson's hands. She looked up at the cage, where Daniel was watching her with wide, fearful eyes. "Why are you doing this?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Mr. Grayson's smile widened. "This mountain holds a secret, Clara, a power that has been hidden for centuries. With it, I can control not just this town, but the entire world. And you, my dear, have helped me unlock it." Clara clenched her fists, anger rising in her chest. "I won't let you hurt my brother. I won't let you use this power for evil." Mr. Grayson laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You're just a child. What can you possibly do to stop me?" Clara didn't have an answer, but she knew she had to try. She looked around the cavern, searching for anything that could help her. Her eyes landed on the crystal still glowing faintly in her hand. She didn't know what it could do, but it was her only hope. As Mr. Grayson began to chant in a language Clara didn't understand, the tree's light grew brighter, and the roots started to move faster, reaching out toward her. Clara held the crystal tightly, closing her eyes and focusing all her thoughts on Daniel, on the love she had for her brother, on the hope that they could be together again. Suddenly, the crystal began to glow brighter, its light spreading through the cavern like a wave. The roots recoiled, and Mr. Grayson's chanting faltered. He stared at Clara, his eyes wide with shock. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice tinged with fear. Clara didn't answer. She didn't know what she was doing, but she could feel the crystal's power flowing through her, warm and comforting. She focused on that feeling, letting it guide her. The light grew brighter and brighter until it filled the entire cavern. Mr. Grayson let out a cry of frustration, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of the crystal's hum. The tree's light began to fade, and the roots stopped moving, falling limp to the ground. The cage holding Daniel creaked open, and he climbed out, rushing to Clara's side. "Clara," he said, pulling her into a tight hug. "You did it!" But Clara knew it wasn't over yet. The crystal's light was still glowing, and she could feel its power surging, as if it had a mind of its own. She looked up at Mr. Grayson, who was now backing away, his face pale with fear. "This isn't the end," he said, his voice trembling. "You may have stopped me for now, but this power, it's too great for you to control." Before Clara could respond, the ground beneath them began to shake violently. The walls of the cavern started to crack, and chunks of rock fell from the ceiling. The crystal's light flared one last time, and then everything went dark. When Clara opened her eyes, she was no longer in the cavern. She was lying on the ground outside the mansion, the crystal still clutched in her hand. Daniel was beside her, looking around in confusion. What happened?" he asked. Clara shook her head. "I don't know, but we're safe now." As they stood up, Clara noticed something strange. The mansion, once grand and imposing, now looked old and crumbling, as if it had been abandoned for years. The garden was overgrown, and the maze was nowhere to be seen. But the most surprising thing was the mountain. It was no longer towering and ominous. Instead, it looked like an ordinary hill, covered in grass and wildflowers. Clara and Daniel exchanged a look, both of them wondering the same thing. What had happened to Mr. Grayson? And what had become of the power he had sought? As they walked away from the mansion, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that their journey wasn't over. The crystal still glowed faintly in her hand, a reminder that there were still mysteries to uncover and dangers to face. But for now, she was just glad to have her brother back. Together, they would figure out what to do next. Clara and Daniel walked away from the crumbling mansion, the weight of the crystal still heavy in Clara's hand. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet town. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt a sense of peace. Daniel was safe, and the nightmare with Mr. Grayson seemed to be over. But as they reached the edge of the forest, Clara stopped and looked back at the mansion one last time. "Do you think he's really gone?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel frowned, following her gaze. "I don't know, but whatever happened in that mountain, it felt like something bigger than just him. That power, it wasn't meant for anyone to control." Clara nodded, her fingers tightening around the crystal. It had stopped glowing now, but she could still feel a faint warmth radiating from it. She didn't know what it was or why it had chosen her, but she knew it wasn't just an ordinary object. It was connected to something ancient, something powerful. "We should keep this safe," she said, holding the crystal up to the fading light. "If Mr. Grayson comes back, or if someone else tries to use it, we have to make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands." Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out together. But for now, let's just go home." Home. The word felt strange to Clara after everything they'd been through. Their small house at the edge of the forest had always been a place of comfort, but now it felt like a sanctuary. As they walked through the familiar streets, Clara noticed how quiet the town was. It was as if the world had paused, waiting for them to return. When they finally reached their house, Clara hesitated at the door. She half expected everything to be different, but when she stepped inside, it was exactly as they had left it. The worn-out couch, the small kitchen table, the pictures of their parents on the wall. It was all the same. For the first time in what felt like forever, Clara smiled. That night, as they sat by the fireplace, Daniel told Clara everything that had happened to him. He explained how Mr. Grayson had tricked him into borrowing money, how he'd been taken to the mansion, and how he'd been trapped in the cage. Clara listened quietly, her heart aching for her brother. She realized how much he had sacrificed to keep her safe, and she vowed to never let anything like this happen again. As the fire crackled and the night grew darker, Clara pulled the crystal from her pocket. It sat in her palm, silent and still, but she could feel its presence, like a quiet hum in the back of her mind. "What do you think it is?" Daniel asked, staring at the crystal. Clara shook her head. "I don't know, but I think it's connected to the mountain, to that tree. Maybe it's a piece of whatever power Mr. Grayson was trying to control." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "If that's true, then it's dangerous, but it also saved us. Maybe it's not just about power. Maybe it's about balance." Clara looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Daniel said slowly, "that power like this. It's not good or bad on its own. It's how people use it that matters. Mr. Grayson wanted to control it, to use it for himself. But you used it to protect someone you love. Maybe that's what it's really for." Clara thought about his words as she stared at the crystal. Maybe Daniel was right. Maybe the crystal wasn't just a tool for power, it was a test of who she was and what she was willing to fight for. "We'll keep it safe," she said finally, her voice firm. "And if anyone like Mr. Grayson ever comes looking for it, we'll be ready." Daniel smiled, a look of pride in his eyes. "We will, together." As the fire burned low and the night deepened, Clara felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead was uncertain, and she knew there would be challenges. But with Daniel by her side and the crystal as a reminder of what she was capable of, she felt ready to face whatever came next. For now, though, they were home, and that was enough. Thank you for joining us on this Heartline journey. Clara's courage reminds us that even in the darkest times, love and determination can light the way. What would you do to protect someone you love? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart.